Should.
Oh, there it is. Okay. All right. Right. So for the two chapters that I synthesized and researched were chapter 30 in the Critical Pedagogy Reader, the continuing conflicts between capitalism and democracy, ramifications of schooling, education by Richard A. Bourgeois. And the other chapter is by Bell Hooks, Teaching to Transgress, Education as the Practice of Freedom, Chapter 12, Confronting Class in the Classroom. So before I start, I want to introduce Professor Peshkov. So Professor Peshkov, he's joining us today. And he was the first person to that I've experienced education using critical thinking and using challenging material in the classroom in our African history class. So Professor Peshkov, thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you.
All right, and now we're going to go ahead and record. So Bourgeois addresses the ongoing conflicts faced within countries that claim to be both capitalist and democratic. Antonio Gramsci taught that capitalist hegemony in advanced capitalist countries must be fought for and maintained within the context of constitutional and even de jure democratic political systems. So the state answers to the capitalist imperative, and the capitalist imperative seeks profit over people. And we were talking about this, how the capitalist state answers to the capitalist imperative,
Right.
which seeks profit over people.
Mm-hmm.
And we can talk more about that. And can you elaborate more on that?
Yeah, sure. So, it's important to see what Gramsci is saying in the view of the state and this economic system, capitalism. Gramsci and others would always criticize, or did always criticize, the state as protecting bourgeois interests, meaning capitalist interests, over the interests of the majority of the people. In fact, this was the problem, right, in the critique of capitalism. The problem with the state was that the state was never responsive to the masses of the people, but rather only to the bourgeois interests, because the capitalist imperative had co-opted the state, had used the state to further its own interests through a constitutional system or through a de jure political system, by custom, in other words, that the state had enormous power and influence in the protection of capital, to the detriment of the majority of the people. And so what Gramsci is saying here, that these two things are antithetical to one another, that capitalism and democracy are antithetical because they serve different imperatives or different interests. And capitalism at the core is undemocratic, for the ways that we can talk about now or later. It depends on when you want to inject that conversation. But the majority of the people, through a democratic process, are not really include, or that process rather really isn't included in a capitalist system.
Yeah, and that really ties in well to the next slide, where Bourgeois
Mm-hmm.
emphasizes the incompatibilities of capitalism and authentic democracy, which
That's
brought
right.
about the conflicting imperative model.
Mm-hmm.
So the power of capital prevented the conversion of de jure democratic rights into de facto ones. So Bourgeois talks about how, in order to solve the very real problem of ecological disaster, growth at the expense of the poor, and ensuring the continuation of human history, we will have to employ the fullest repertory of forms. And this includes communities, neighborhoods, and families. And this is what you were referring to. So we were talking about the difference between de jure and de facto. And when referring to this in the democratic principles and practices, how do they relate?
Yeah, so this is a really important sort of a point that we have to kind of think about and talk about a little bit. So let's look at this quote that he begins with. The power of capital prevented the conversion of de jure democratic rights into de facto ones, meaning that the power of capital in a capitalist system prevented the kinds of democratic rights that, let's just use the American example. We can look at capitalism all over the world, but let's just use the American example since we're all familiar with it. It prevented the kinds of democratic ideals that we said we believed in the very beginnings of this country, right? As the founding fathers went to work at constructing a government based on the ideals that they said that they believed in, right? Liberty, justice, freedom, independence, all of those things that we see in the preamble to the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, in the Declaration of Independence, et cetera. And these were de jure democratic rights. In other words, that they were universally supposed to be applied, and that everyone, by fact of being a human being, by the just a mere fact of being a human being, was in possession of these things called rights. In the political sense, then, the government that the founding fathers were assembling and creating was supposed to protect those political individual rights. But we know that those rights were very, very limited to a very small group of people from the beginning, and American people have been demanding to be included more and more. So those de jure democratic rights, in other words, all men are created equal, that is a customary sort of ideal that we all believe in, although we don't practice that. And so the critique here is that capitalism, in the way that it formed and in the way that it perpetuated throughout American history, prevented those de jure democratic rights to be then codified into law. It took a lot of work and a lot of organizing and a lot of resistance by the people, all kinds of different people, for the state to be responsive and to then codify those rights into the Constitution of the United States or into law in general. And so I think that the conversation here between de jure and de facto is one that speaks of rights that we should customarily practice, and practices that are conducive to the protection of political and human rights. They have to be in a capitalist system written down and enforced, because capitalism seeks to undermine those rights, and it seeks to undermine those rights because its most important motive is profit, right, to the detriment of the majority of people, to the rights. So capitalism in and of itself, as Gramsci points out, in and of itself isn't concerned or doesn't make a claim for any kind of sense of morality or working for the ensuring of rights or making moral claims. Capitalism does what capitalism is supposed to do: produce a profit, no matter what way that profit is produced. That's the fiduciary responsibility that we were talking about earlier of capitalism, right? The fiduciary responsibility of capitalist enterprises to make profits for their shareholders. But it says nothing about morality and rights and all those kinds of things. And remember, Noha, when we were speaking about the second part of this, when you brought up the point about the ecological disaster that we're going through today in 2020 America, and the enormous problem that humanity faces with the destruction of the environment and the warming of the planet, here is this critique, sort of living out in the contemporary moment. And you had brought up the point of the polar ice caps that were melting, right? And we said that ExxonMobil sees that as an opportunity, as the polar ice caps melt in the north, to drill even more in that sea because the ice isn't there, right? Rather than thinking about the ecological disasters of an economy, of a world economy that depends on the burning of carbon, the burning of fuels, and it doesn't see it that way. It just sees a short-term profit to the detriment of the ecological disaster and the detriment of the planet, right? So again, here's the criticism of capitalism, that because capitalism is only focused on profits, and really short-term profits, as capitalism has evolved to the contemporary kind of capitalism that we have. It is to the detriment of even the environment.
Mm-hmm.
So
And
let me just interject one thing here that since we're talking about Gramsci, let's look at Marx's quote. And Marx famously said that capitalism contains its own gravediggers. In other words, for the sake of a profit or the profit motive, capitalism will do whatever it needs to do to include killing itself. Here is the ExxonMobil example, right? ExxonMobil is that corporation also is comprised of human beings that will be gravely affected by the environment, yet it only focuses on that short-term profit.
right. So when I think of capitalism, I think of no responsibility, just profit. And this does go into the school systems as well. And the public schools, Bourgeois was saying, are Janus-faced. And this was something that I thought was really interesting to use this term, Janus-faced, because of the Janus, the god, is two-faced. So they're two abstract or concrete dualities that this Janus god, what he is but the middle ground of living and dead, youth and the old, or war and peace. So he represents that duality. And for Bourgeois to refer to schools as Janus-faced, I thought that was interesting because of the two contrasting aspects. So public schools are answerable to capitalism imperative, and they're also answerable to democracy. So how they're answerable to the capitalist one is that they request that schools be structured in a way to produce students who will be competent and willing workers. So that's part of the whole capitalist, that whole narrative that we were talking about.
Right. The capitalist paradigm, the model.
Right. And this having no responsibility for the environment, or only caring about gains, right?
Right, right. To
Yeah.
the detriment of democracy here, your second point.
Yeah. So, and the other, and this is the what I find to be really interesting, is that capitalism imperative and the democracy are not, they're really contrasting, because the democracy and or egalitarianism imperative aims at empowering students to become critical thinkers, workers, and citizens that can use their critical skills in all aspects of their life, not just for profit. But the issue here, and we've talked about this too, is that capitalist imperative is so much more powerful and greater than that of the democratic one. And so and this makes me wonder, like, how is education shaped by capitalism, and what types of educational or schools are undemocratic when it comes to capitalism?
Yeah, that is an interesting question and a very complex one. So we have to understand that the educational system within a capitalist society will reproduce the norms of that society. And the norms of that society, at least in part, and depending the degree we can argue about, I would say to a large degree, are shaped by capitalist interests. So that means that schools have to face two different things simultaneously. They have to face the undemocratic nature of capitalism and the way that education then is delivered in a capitalist way, which I'll explain here in just a second. And at the same time has to promote a very democratic, egalitarian form of education in which students will question and learn how to think for themselves as independent thinkers. So let's go back to the first one. How the system of education delivers sort of in the capitalist way. Students are many times, trained to think, or are enculturated into a culture that school, especially higher education, post-secondary schooling, is a means to a better life, meaning that a more economically stable life, which in and of itself isn't, false. That's true, right? We see that, we can see that through the studies, that more people who have post-secondary educations tend to earn more in life. But the idea then becomes in our schooling systems that schools are a place to go and get something. Just like capitalism has within capitalism, the market system of exchange of commodities uh, is, 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 is a way of taking one commodity and exchanging it for money in order that you can buy some other commodity, right? So commodity one fetches a price in the market. That money then can be used to buy commodity two or anything else that you want. So money is that exchange medium. So that means then, with that kind of thinking, it's almost a quid pro quo. I give you this, you give me money for that. Education becomes sort of that same kind of capitalistic model of the market. In fact, we say this all the time, the marketplace of ideas, right? So even capitalist language then begins to infiltrate the way that we think about education. So we go to a school, we get an education, we pay a tuition, we get a degree, and with that degree, we go out and we get a job, a profession, right? We become economically secure. That's the capitalist model, which places upon it then, upon the educational system, this sort of impetus to graduate so that you could become a wealthier person or a more economically independent and stable person. So that I would call a system of schooling. You school people, you tell them what to do, you tell them how to answer, you tell them how to pass the class, and they do it. And then they get something in return, this quid pro quo. But the democratic model of that would be education. So education and schooling here would be two different things, right? Dr. Cornel West always talks about the difference between schooling and education. And in this country, we school the poor and we educate the better off. Education is a profound a profound path that one walks down in the introspective nature of education. You look at yourself by questioning yourself. You come to something that is truer in life, in your own life, in society, by questioning. And the ways in which we question in the classroom and the ways that we hear other voices in the classroom is an absolutely democratic way of doing that, as long as the conditions are set correctly, right? So that kind of democratic egalitarian classroom that hears all of the voices, that uses the democratic principles of argument and of listening, and then responding directly to the argument that one might not agree with. That is a democratic process. And at the end, the student, as a free thinking individual, is left to make up his or her own mind about what is the best political system. Let's say, for example, if we're talking about poli-sci, what do we understand from history if we're looking in a history classroom? What were the causes and effects, and what causes were more important than other causes that had these kinds of effects? That is the individual coming to that conclusion through a democratic egalitarian process of education, not necessarily of schooling, because the emphasis there is to become a thinking person, right. A deeply reflective thinking person, not a schooled person that you acquired some kinds of certain particular skills and acquired and have collected certain degrees that will give you this certain jobs. Right. And so here's the critique between this kind of anti-egalitarian capitalist system that capitalism always sets up, because in and of itself, capitalism is undemocratic, and an education system that seeks to cultivate a deeply thinking and independent individual that could even criticize capitalism, and that should criticize capitalism, and should also criticize the critiques of capitalism, Marxism, for example, or any other kinds of socialist that we want to look at. It is, again, the education produces through a democratic way, produces a very deep independent and deep thinking person. And I think that's what this democratic imperative is all about.
Right. And we were actually talking about this, and we're going to go more into the classroom practices later,
Right.
like democratic practices in the
Right.
classroom. But this also, the Janus faced schools, the public schools being contradictory, is also Bell Hooks talks about it in a different, like kind of like a different way, about how like the school behavior is what you need to have to make it versus the what your background, how you were raised. And this specifically, she talks about the African American students and how they in the public schools, they these students express frustration, anger,
Mhm.
and sadness when they try to assimilate to the expected academic culture that is made for and by the white middle class. And she goes on and says that the African American students are being encouraged to be flexible between the school and home culture. Accepting one culture doesn't negate or disrespect the other. So, and she goes on and says that it takes courage to embrace a version of wholeness of being that does not reinforce the capitalist version that suggests that one must always give something to gain something.
Mhm.
And
Absolutely.
yeah, and we were talking a lot about this, and I wanted you to tell, I know because you teach African history, and you know, not just African history, but that's how I got to know you, is through
Mhm.
African history. So
Right.
so I wanted to know from your experience, when you were when you're teaching African American students, I wanted to see like a real world example of how what Bell Hooks is talking about here, and
Mhm.
how does this relate with your experience teaching African history and with your
Good.
students?
Yeah. No, that's a really important point that we should discuss. And you and I were in the same classroom for the history of Africa, but I also teach the American history sections, right? U.S. history with an emphasis on the African American experience, particularly. So
Mhm.
here we can discuss the conditions of the classroom that Bell Hooks talks about here, and class in sort of a broader sense.
Mhm.
Remember that when we speak of class is just a short way of saying classification, right?
Mhm.
So classifications of people through the socialist argument really is an economic classification, right? Those people who are in an economic system that are exploited through economic means. That's sort of the general way that we understand class. Bell Hooks talks about that, but Bell Hooks broadens that discussion to include the classification of African American students who are culturally different from their white counterparts in the classroom. But the standard educational system wasn't really set up for Black Americans.
Right.
So let's think about this from a historical point of view. Because of, first of all, slavery, which we don't even need to discuss because we understand the oppressive nature of that. But even after the Civil War, through the period of Reconstruction and then post-Reconstruction period in American history, a educational system was never set up to include Black people in this country. And when they were always separate but equal, or claimed to be equal, but they were never equal, those conditions, but always separate.
Mhm.
So remember, we were speaking about a very specific example on per pupil spending in Florida uh, during the late 18th century, early 19th century. It was a 10-to-1 ratio or thereabouts, right? $22 for every white student and $2 with some change for every Black student. Because those schools were separated, they weren't funded equally, et cetera. And we have all of these problems. So that meant that the educational system in general, K through 12 and post-secondary, obviously in professional schools, were never set up and organized in ways to include Black people. Now, once the 1960s, especially Brown v. Board, begins to assault this segregation within education, the fundamental ways that education was set up for in America for Black people, or I'm sorry, for white people, was maintained. And so when African American students enter an institution, that isn't really designed for them, they must learn how to navigate this system.
Right.
I mean,
And
you brought up, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah, and this is the whole cultural part of class that we were talking about. So um, yeah, and this was just like a point that I wanted to make was the um, like their points of references. We were talking about even their points of references, and Bell Hooks talks about that too.
Mhm.
And their speech pattern, they have to change it, and the
Right,
words they use. So they have to now take on the habits of those that are privileged.
right,
Yeah.
right. So remember you asked me for a real world example, and we were
Yeah.
talking about this before, and we were saying that in my classroom, so when we have, because discussion is a huge part of the class experience and the learning of history in my class, we have class discussions. We have small group discussions, and then we open it up for a larger classroom discussion.
Mhm.
Okay, so here's a perfect example of what you just said, Noha. You said that the ways in which we speak, the language that we use, in education, many times we set up a hierarchy. We say this is proper English and proper academic speech, and colloquial language or colloquialisms are not wanted or are somehow less than.
Mhm.
And what I do in my classroom is we say, when we have a discussion, of course we use colloquialisms. We use colloquial language to describe the places from which we come. And I happen to teach in classrooms that are 70% of my class, not necessarily just the Black students, but all of the classroom, right? The classroom statistics, 70% of my students across the board come from communities that are at poverty or below poverty, or slightly above, but not much high, not much above the poverty line. So that means there's an economic class component to this. And that also means then that the reality from which they come, my students, and by the way, I came from that very same community when I was growing up. It means that we have learned to use a certain colloquial language that explains and betrays the places that we come from and the class in which we occupy, and that's okay. Classrooms have to be a vibrant place where we can feel comfortable discussing what we're discussing from our own class lens or ideological lens, to bring in these understandings of self and community in discussing academic topics. And in that process, then, it is completely acceptable to use colloquial language to make references to one's own I'll just use myself, to my own roots of poverty and the kinds of places that I grew up that were poverty stricken, because it shaped obviously who I am and my understanding of the environment in which I live, the universe in which I live. And so what Bell Hooks is talking about here is many times African American students come into places that are like Stanford, where she studied, right? These exclusive institutions where everyone, because of the nature of these Ivy League schools, or we can say, top ranked R1 institutions, have always recruited from a certain class or strata of American people who have cultural and economic ties and realities that are much different from those who come from different classes. And this distinction then is what she's getting at. She's talking about the realization of African American students in those kinds of places where they must code switch. And you had brought this up earlier in our discussions about code switching and learning how to basically swim in two different streams at the same time. And depending on the place that you are, you have to either use this language or use this sort of cultural anchors or economic anchors, or when you're outside of that environment, you use a whole different set of anchors.
Right.
Right. So this is what I think that she's getting at here at the very sort of heart of this is the experience, particularly of Black students in institutions that were never created for them, but learned how to navigate a system that is slowly beginning to incorporate changes within that educational system that will then include more and more cultural and class sort of perspectives.
Right. And this is exactly what Martin and Carnoy were talking about, and Henry Liven were talking about, in chapter 13 by Boysois.
Right,
And they, in their book, they have this book called Schooling and Work in the Democratic State.
right.
And like you're saying, like schools are starting to incorporate more of the different backgrounds into the academic system. But they were saying schools can be either one or two. They can be institutions that embody and reproduce the unequal and hierarchical class divisions under capitalism,
Mhm.
or they can be institutions that produce empowered citizens with critical skills that allow them to be in a workplace that is fair, equal, and democratic. So are are reproducing the dominant capitalist relationships and values in both their economic and political life. And this is um, like, how is capitalism? So we have these two contradicting forces, I'll call, and how is capitalism undemocratic, and how does it disempowering, and how is this related, and how does that like link to the school, like education? Because we were talking about how it isn't democratic, but how does that work also um, in education?
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful question. Let me just start with that before I forget, because then I'll go off and something else. Um, let's say you were in my classroom and I was a white middle-aged professor
Mhm,
from a family who had several generations of educated people,
mhm,
and I come from a upper middle class, economically speaking, right, upper middle class family. My perspective in the kinds of things that I would ask you to read about, let's say in American history, would be the kinds of things that I would know about or feel comfortable about, not necessarily understanding even because of the place that I occupy in society. The kinds of readings that might be interesting or valuable or explanatory to you. So imagine if I gave you only authors who reflected who I am, white men from a certain economic strata, from their own perspectives. What would that say to a Black student in my classroom? What would it say to a Muslim student in my classroom? What would it say to a poor student in my classroom? You see, so this power dynamic, this replication of an undemocratic system is also shaped by ways that we don't even consider are influenced by capitalism, right? Because as a professor, I would say, well, I'm just giving you information that I find valuable, but I never question why I found that to be valuable, or that what I find valuable is equal to what you might find valuable, because my students might want to read about works by authors who are not men, who are not by works that are not straight men, perhaps men that are not white, men that are or women that are occupy different stratas of American society. Again, in order to fill out that educational understanding of who one is. So that's also important to keep in mind when we look at power relationships, when we're looking at the ways that in which the anti-democratic impulse of capitalism is reproduced in the classroom. And that's a struggle, because it means that we as instructors at whatever level have to constantly be aware and conscious of the kinds of choices that we make, and the interrogation of ourselves that has to be there every single year that we begin our teaching assignment, because we're constantly evaluating and questioning ourselves. Am I listening to the diversity of voices? Do I understand what my students need and want? And and if I don't understand that, uh, can I acquire a reading list, or new ways of structuring classroom dynamics, that I could call upon people that can fill in my own missing gaps, right? In
right.
my own understanding. That's also important in the ways that we construct more egalitarian classrooms by being aware of our own limitations, in other words.
Right, right. All right.
Secondly, let me answer your question specifically about capitalism and about the undemocratic nature of that. Remember, as we talked about before, capitalism is undemocratic because the majority of workers who come to a capitalist enterprise have no voice in that capitalist enterprise. Every corporation has a board of directors. Those board of directors, that number at best 15 people, depending on the size of the corporation, make all of the decisions of what to produce, where to produce it, how much of it to be produced, what to sell it for, and more importantly, what to do with those profits. That is not, those decisions are not asking the majority of the workers their opinion or their input on that process. For example, if GM is going to shut down a plant in Youngstown, Ohio, it doesn't ask the workers in Youngstown, Ohio, whether it's a good idea or not to shut down the plant and move it abroad where labor is cheaper. Because the obvious point here is that if they did, the workers in Youngstown would say, of course not, we don't want to close down this plant. That means I have to give up my job. I'm not voluntarily going to sacrifice my job. So already in the nature of capitalist enterprise, we see this undemocratic way of operating.
Right.
That the majority of people, the workers, are not included in the most basic and most fundamental decisions about their own lives.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, this also, that's how the schools are too. So the how there's like no justice to the majority of the people when it comes to the schools as well. And when Boysois was talking about the people of color and the working class and immigrants and how they're considered lacking and unworthy, and that teachers need to empower students with the skills they need in order to become citizens who value social justice over personal gains. But then I was thinking back to readings that we've had with the critical pedagogy reader.
Mhm.
And in chapter 5, there were two people that were Willis and Bordeaux. They were had conflicting views on why working class kids fail. And Willis was saying, he insists that working class kids get working class jobs by means of their refusal to accept the discipline entailed in curricular mastery and by their rebellion against school authority. And Bordeaux is saying, well, no, because working class kids fail because they are culturally deprived, or in the American critical version, are assaulted by the hidden curriculum and school pedagogy that subsumes kids under the prevailing order. And so these 2 points were made in chapter 5, and I know I didn't send you the chapter 5 to read that, but there were previous readings. But Willis's point, and I wanted to connect Willis's point to slide number 5, where Bell Hooks, she encourages that African American students be flexible so that they can be successful in the academic world while not giving up their home culture. So does Willis' statement, does it contradict Hooks' point? It's worded different, but I feel like Willis, what he's saying and what Bell Hooks is also asking African American students to do, are they contradictory?
Yeah, from my reading, absolutely.
Okay.
Because so let's look at Willis's his premise. He's saying that working class students fail to accept the discipline and fail to accept authority of the schooling system. So then they fail out of school. They get working class jobs, and really that's their own fault.
Mm.
So the assumption here is that the playing field is level for everyone, and you just don't want to accept it and you don't want to excel because you're undisciplined. Again, so now the onus is on the individual, which ignores the entire historical system of constructing the way that it was constructed in the United States, the educational system. We've never had an equal playing field for those people who have historically been marginalized in our history. That playing field has never been equal. It has, the gap has shrunk and it has widened at different points in our history, but it's never been equal. And so to say, well, working class students who come from these communities, they're just lazy, or they just don't, they're undisciplined, or they just are rebellious against authority, misses the historical development of American educational system. And Hooks and Bordeaux and other people who are saying, no, it's the system itself that has to be subverted. It's the system itself, the educational system itself, that has to be examined and identified where those points of reproducing a system that has marginalized students and had never been built for those students. Those are the points that we have to identify, and we have to get in and change. Hooks is saying, I, as a pragmatist, this is what I'm reading into bell hooks, I, as a pragmatist, understand the system. We as Black people have to do two things. We have to learn how to operate within a system, right, that has all of these gaps in spite of those gaps. But we should never never lose and always remember where we come from and the dignity of the places that we come from and who we are as human beings, right? It doesn't mean that you're a poor person, you are less dignified than somebody who is much more wealthier than you. So dignity isn't tied to economic class, Hooks is saying. Right, dignity is a human thing. You possess dignity for your humanity, not because of your class, economic class. And what she's saying is, but within that system, you have to also jump through certain hoops because the system is broken. And we understand that in a capitalist system, a degree, a post-secondary degree, is going to help you move within that system. So let's not, until the day comes where we can completely reconstruct the system, let's not be naive about that. We understand we have to move through that system, but let's not lose focus and lose sight of who we are as people, as dignified people.
Right.
And so Will is here saying that paradigm really doesn't exist, or that he's giving it very sort of short shrift. That he's saying that it's, everyone's equal. Everyone has the same chance, and if you're undisciplined or if you don't accept authority, somehow you are less than. This is the argument of, it's your personal responsibility to that. Okay. Which there's always a component of personal responsibility to anything, but to ignore the systemic inequalities and inequities would be to have your blinders on.
Right, and Bell Hooks was discussing this also, how she talks about there's different powers within the classroom, and privileges. So there's power with like sex, race, and background. So these students are granted more of a voice in the classroom. So she was talking about how we could, as teachers, practice ways in the classroom so that we can make sure that each individual has equal time to voice their opinion. And her practice was not just saying, okay, well, each student gets 5 minutes. So she prepped in advance. She had the students write down their thoughts. So it would be just like a paragraph. And she gave their students the time they needed to bring their thoughts together about whatever topic they were discussing. And they would take that paragraph and they would read it to their classmates and to the teacher, so that there was a whole class learning experience. And it was, what I really liked about it is that she did give time for the students to learn. I mean, to write their point down, and for all of them to learn together from the different perspectives coming from all the different students that were in the classroom, and respecting them and she was saying to look at, she made sure that, that was emphasized, making sure that each student was looked at and respected, and everyone was engaging in that student's point and their perspective. And she made sure that all students have the freedom to speak and should be given equal opportunities to speak. And she was also referring to, so that doesn't mean that those students that do have power in the classroom, that we need to take away their voice, and now we're just doing what the system is already practicing, which we want to give equal power to all of our students, regardless of their background or privileges. So
Right.
So and then she goes on and she talks about the power in the classroom, and she used to have like a negative perspective about what power is. And so she made a mistake, she said, about having, giving no power in the classroom, because she saw power as abusive and a way to dominate the people, until she learned that power of the teacher can be used either to challenge the capitalist and class hierarchical structures, or educators have the power to play into the narrative and reinforce it. So she could be, she had the freedom to be either or. And then she goes into talking about how there's the professor training versus the progressive professor. So, but based on like everything that we've been talking about, like capitalists in the classroom and democracy. So we've spoken about like how can we create, like in the classroom, and based on your experiences, like what you've been doing in the classroom, like how can we create a place that is safe and nurturing and allows all these different perspectives. So Belle gives us her example and her practice. So what do you do in the classroom?
Yeah. I wish I had the definitive answer, which of course I don't, because there are many people much smarter than I, that are having these discussions and have had these discussions for a long time. This isn't an easy nut to crack, but there are ways in which that we can experiment in the classroom in order to become more effective teachers, because that's all we are, right? Doesn't matter if you're a kindergarten teacher or a PhD professor at a R1 university, you are a teacher at the core. And so part of that is to try to create an environment where, again, it is a democratic environment, a safe environment where people can begin to challenge their most deeply held values and listen attentively to opposing viewpoints, and then begin to try to answer those opposing viewpoints. Right? It's not good enough just to say, I don't agree with you, but why don't I don't know why I don't, I just don't. It's something, that's not good enough. We in education have to be able to again, in a profound way, learn how to answer those opposing viewpoints. How do I do that in my classroom? Well, here again, let me just make this comment about capitalism. The best way to do it is what you just said, have students write a paragraph. But I have a classroom of 90 students. There's no possible way. I only have an hour and 20 minutes. There's no possible way I would even get a quarter of those students in that kind of a discussion, because I teach 90 students at once. The question is, why do I teach 90 students at once instead of 9 students? Because this is a problem of efficiency. School systems, the college that I teach gets paid, right, and is always worried about efficiency. How many students in the classroom? We have a minimum of 45 students to be enrolled in a full, that's a full class, that's a full load. There's the variations of that, until the class is completely canceled because there's not enough. But the administrative apparatus always worries about the efficiency. How many students are you teaching in one classroom, right? There's a lot of nuances to that, but that's the general feeling. That's a very capitalist way of thinking about that. The efficiency model. It's inefficient to teach 9 students rather than teaching 90 at once. That's a capitalist way of thinking about that, right? Yeah. Because capitalism strives to be efficient, produce the most, the best at the least cost. Again, here's capitalism seeping into this educational system. Okay, given that, again, let's use the pragmatic view of bell hooks. I understand that that's the system I operate in, but how do I create that environment in which then we can create a more responsive classroom to the students? Well, one of the ways that I do it is through discussions, which we already spoke about, but also a democratic way of asking the students about what they would like to read. So for example, I have a slew of readings. I actually have more readings than I usually know what to do with. So I ask students, okay, so we can read about, here's this block of reading. So here we have indigenous voices, we have Black people, let's say if I'm talking about the early part of United States history, we have Black people's voices, we have slave narratives and from the free community, we have women here, and under women we have, women who were white middle class women, women who were abolitionists, who were former slaves or come from the free community. Or we have this set of readings, then we can go something else, maybe more of a class focus. The students are going to read, but the students have an input in what kinds of readings that they're going to do. Now, all of the readings, maybe I have 3 different sort of columns of readings to do. I select that. That's my power, right? In order to shape the kinds of readings that they're going to be doing in the ways that your professor has introduced and the readings that you're doing, right? And has selected them. So we have that power, but within that, we can also include in a democratic way what students would prefer to read. Perhaps I have a regular classroom of 40 students. Many of them are female, and they really want to hear the female voice, a woman's perspective on history. So we do that instead of doing something else, right? We'll read, I don't know, Sojourner Truth instead of Frederick Douglass. That's okay. Both of them are important. But one is from a woman's perspective, and maybe female students in that classroom would rather listen to that voice. So as a professor, you have to set that you have to be flexible and you have to be creative and you have to set that environment where students feel empowered and they see themselves in the education that you're presenting to them, right? That's really important. If students don't see themselves in the academic discipline, then it's just, again, another hoop to jump through, rather than the profound understanding of what it means to them in explaining who they are and a larger explanation of the society that they belong in.
And that's one of the things I remember in your class is that you did bring in, you did interrogate like who the author is and what their, motives might be. And you did bring in materials that were, coming from primary sources and coming from African,
African
Afrocentric,
authors.
African authors. And the 2 points here that Bell Hooks was making too was the difference between professor training versus progressive professor. And the point that you were just saying right now reminds me of where she was saying most progressive professors are more comfortable striving to challenge class biases through the material studied than they are with interrogating how class biases shape conduct in the classroom and transforming their pedagogical conduct. So you do bring that material to your students. You do have the power, of course, to choose what it is that they can access, but it's very democratic because you are bringing in the challenging material, but you're also very democratic about it. So they get to choose what perspective they want to read about. So I thought that was really interesting because I've seen you do with that practice. So the professor training, which makes a lot of sense and is what is happening. So the training has disempowered us, socialized us to cope effectively only with a single mode of interactions based on middle class values. And did you feel like you had to make the effort to become a progressive professor, or did it come naturally to you?
No, I think it came naturally from, again, the places that I occupied. So let me give you a little background on me. I'm the first person in my family to go to college. I'm the first person to graduate with a degree, right? I'm the first in my family, my generation, my 2 sisters and I were the first to be born in this country. I come from an immigrant family. I was the first in my family to join the army, so I was a veteran on top of that. So that, and also I grew up in an immigrant community here in Sacramento that was, working poor. And so, for example, what do I mean by working poor? As an immigrant, I never had medical insurance growing up. We had home remedies. There's a tea for that. There's always some kind of a home remedy. You don't go to see a doctor because you don't have medical insurance. And that shaped me. All of those experiences obviously shaped the lens and through which I saw history and I understood history. I'm a historian. That's my discipline.
Yeah.
So being a progressive historian, to me just came naturally because of the places that I occupied, coming up, living and coming up from where I do. And then reading about the historical record and understanding, oh, wait a minute, there were a lot of people like me in the American past. I happen to be a Latin Americanist, so that's my sort of expertise in Latin America. And then when I look back into Latin America, I say, oh, well, these are all people who are just like me, who had these kinds of ideas, and in fact, always challenged the status quo because the status quo was oppressive to them. So almost by its very nature, I became progressive, meaning leftist, if we understand the political spectrum, right? Those on the left were always going to be challenging the status quo. And as you go further out left, as you become more and more progressive, to the extreme left, where you can look at communist, socialists, and then communists and so forth, right? It is because you challenge a status quo that doesn't work for you, or that negates, in my case, many of the ideas that we said we believed in as Americans, but we didn't live up to. And so it was almost a natural fit for me then to teach my students from a progressive perspective, one that included many of the students who were just like me, first, and came from the socioeconomic backgrounds that I came from. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a critique of that. So, for example, if we're looking at Black freedom struggle, which I was just lecturing on, and we look at the Black freedom struggle as challenging racism and the systemic racism in America, but within that Black freedom struggle, there was always a oppressive level of patriarchy going on too. So Black women were at once being discriminated against on the basis of gender, although they were fighting for all Black people's struggles to be treated as equals in America. And Black men served as oppressors within these organizations, not all, but many, while at the same time seeking to be treated as equals in the larger, broader white American society. So we critique that, we bring that up. We have to critique that if we're going to be intellectually honest, right? So we not only critique the system at large that protects the status quo, that marginalizes, but we also critique those things that are, let's say, are on our side, that come from our side, that are also wrong, that are also inconsistent with these moral values that we hold, or the ideals of American democracy that we hold. And if they're contrary, then we have to critique them as well. Again, it ties back to your point earlier that you were making about creating the conditions in the classroom that are constantly having to be reevaluated.
Right. So, wow. So we talked a lot about capitalism and democracy in class.
Yeah,
So,
we did. I
yeah.
hope we can fit all this in.
Yeah. So, thank you so much, Professor Peshkov. I really appreciate you sharing your story and your experience with all of this. So, thank you. I appreciate you. And we are
Absolutely. No, absolutely.
done.
And I appreciate you inviting me to participate in your wonderful project, and being an astute student of mine. And I know that you are now the same in these classes that you're taking. I think it's obvious. So
Thank
um,
you. Thank you.
yeah, I'll toot that horn a little bit. I think you're a wonderful scholar in the making too. So
Thank you, Professor Peshkov. Thank you. I appreciate you. All right. And now I'm going to stop share. I'm going to stop record.